Good afternoon, friends and colleagues. It's a delight to have with us today Professor Harpal Singh. Gurharpal Singh is a Dean of Arts and Humanities and a Professor of Interreligious Relations and Development in the Department of Study of Religion at the School of Oriental and African Studies of London. He has had a number of celebrated chairs like Nadi Dinsha Chair in the School of Philosophy, Theology and Religion at the University of Birmingham, and had the C.R. Parekh Chair and Indian Politics at the University of Hull in England, my old university. But all this religious talk should not distract you. He's actually by training a political scientist. And today he's going to talk about the partition of British India into India and Pakistan. The 70th anniversary is coming up. As he says, it witnessed the largest movement of people in the 20th century and left over 1 million dead. But that was not all. He doesn't talk about the brutalization and violence to women. And he says it was a seminal event in the shaping of the history of post-colonial South Asia. As I said, Professor Harpal Singh is a political scientist deeply into memory, religion, identity, and other issues. But today he talks about the past as a political scientist, and for us it's a problem. You're a good historian, it's behind you. If you're a political scientist, it's not clear if it is with you or if it is ahead of you or if time is linear at all. And many of these things have been subject of research for Professor Harpal Singh, and there have been a series of books on these issues. Ethnic Conflict in India is one of the more recent ones. Partition in India, 2005, from Cambridge University Press, was a seminal book. It's a defining book. And before that, he had done Region and Partition. That's another book. His book on Sikh nationalism is in press. And I think there are few more books in the future. He has brought with us a dear friend of ISAS, Mr. Amardeep Singh, whose book we have got from him as a very generous gift, talking about the Sikh heritage in Pakistan, and which is beautifully photographed and commented by you, and you have got another book in making. And this has become a very important meeting point. I mean, we were here this morning, and this is a good opportunity to also introduce Professor Shumit Ganguly from the United States. He has a Rabindranath Tagore chair. He's currently a visiting professor here with us, and he would be also speaking to this group at a later stage. I would now give the floor to Professor Harpal Singh. He has about 40 minutes, and since he has already promised me a working paper for our ISAS publications, I can relax and sit back and listen, and there will be a note taker, so you'll also get some notes from this conversation. Thank you very much for joining us, Harpal. Mm-hmm. You have the floor.
Thank you, Subrata, for that wonderful introduction. I'm really delighted to be here. Coming to Singapore has been a long time in the making. Singapore has been very much in my imagination ever since I was 60, as a O-level high school student. My imagination was caught by a novel, The Singapore Grip by Farrell, and thereafter the history of Singapore, particularly the post-Second World War history. And in the early 90s, I used to teach a course on political development, which included the Four Tigers, and I taught a lot on Singapore. And also, I had the fortune to write a small entry on Lee Kuan Yew, who was a student at LSE, and through that I learned quite a lot about the island and its history. So I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted to make contact with Subrata again. It seems to me that I'm always chasing Subrata, whether it's from Hull, Heidelberg, and now Singapore. I seem to be following him around the globe. I hope he doesn't go anywhere too far next time. As Subrata said, I've been in senior management at School of Orient and African Studies for this is my 6th year. And so what I'm going to say might sound a bit rough at the edges, but please forgive me. I am a political scientist, but after 9/11, I became quite deeply concerned about the relationship between religion and politics. And I moved from Hull to the University of Birmingham into a department of theology and religions. And thereafter, I carried out a large project on religions and development in India, Pakistan, Nigeria, and Tanzania. The talk today will be based largely around my work with Professor Ian Talbot. We have produced a few books together, and much of it's based on the partition of India. It's tentative, suggestive, and in the nature of a working paper, which might then turn into a review article. When the work was, the title was proposed, Subrata suggested that I talk about some of the long-term implications of partition and how it continues to bear upon the politics and the polities of South Asia today. As Subrata has mentioned, we write in the work that partition was the most significant event in modern South Asian history. But what level of causation can we still attribute to partition after 70 years? After all, as one wit put it not too long ago, only Punjab and Bengal were partitioned. No other provinces were affected in that way that these two were. And can we really read into contemporary South Asia that which happened so long ago? The partition, I would argue, is, the study of partition is largely studied in terms of its causes. However, far too often it remains the elephant in the room of South Asian politics, to which sometimes everything is attributed and others nothing. And in between these two extremes, I will try to steer a middle course. I'm a political scientist, but also I'm a historian. My PhD was on the communist movement in Punjab, and those of you who know me, it's a very archival, history-based research. And I will try to link history and politics together in the discipline of historical sociology. And I think those historical sociology brings together things that we can perhaps further reflect on in our understanding of partition and partition processes which continue to impact today. So in the last 30 years or so, the study of partition has changed significantly. Traditionally, it was institution-based, based around the school of high politics, what great men did, and the consequences of their actions. As disciplinary interests have changed, there has been more accommodation, for example, of place of women, of caste, of socio-economically marginalized groups. And so the study of the subject is changing as trends are changing in terms of social and political analysis. But one thing that's really interesting is that the more recent publications have sought to deal with the long-term implications. That is how the critical event that happened in 1947 continues to shape the lives of people in terms of experience, but also institutions. Here I recall the work of Yasmin Khan, The Great Partition. She's written in 2007, but much more importantly, Vizara Zamidar's work, appropriately titled The Long Partition, The Making of South Asia. And my own colleagues in the UK, Sara Ansari and William Gould, who in their different writings trace the long-term implications of the making of citizenship, identities and rights, both in UP and in Sindh in Pakistan. Alongside the politics, alongside the work of historians, I would like to emphasize that a new generation of historical sociologists is emerging, drawing on historical institutionalism and increasingly interested in 1947, as I've said, as a critical event, a critical juncture that has shaped the template of post-1947 politics. Subjects of study here include constitutionalism, militarism in Pakistan, Subrata's own student whose PhD I examined in Nottingham, religious minorities. One of my students has just completed a PhD on that, and affirmative action. In these accounts, partition is viewed, as I've said, as a critical juncture which set the template for the political or development and indeed path development of post-47 South Asian states. And it's a path development from which the states find it difficult, indeed nigh impossible to escape. It's against this background that I will give the key aspects of my talk. Clearly, I cannot cover the partition in 40 minutes. So what I'm going to do is to focus on three key legacies or three key dimensions which link the various aspects that I mentioned together. Ideological legacies, the human dimension of partition, understanding the India-Pakistan rivalry, and then I shall briefly touch on the prospects for change, or how partition, or the trap of partition, might be sprung in the future. And I will summarize thereafter. Okay. In our book, we wrote that partition is an ongoing process, that as such, as an idea and as lived experience, it defies closure and is very easy prey to invention and recreation. Partition remains a powerful ideological resource for South Asia's two leading states, namely India and Pakistan. It's a legitimizing ideology of nationhood and is writ large into narratives of the nationalism of these two countries. To put it eloquently, as Kilnani says, partition is the unspeakable sadness at the heart of the idea of India. A memento mori, that what makes India possible, also profoundly diminishes the integral value of the idea of India. For Pakistan, on the other hand, it has become a shorthand for Renan's definition of a nation as a daily plebiscite that is conducted as an everyday ritual at the Wagah border. How the event is understood in national ideologies is remarkably contrasting. For India, it is a permanent reminder of the destructive power of religious nationalism in a multinational, multi-religious, and multi-ethnic society. Our former colleague at the University of Hull, Bhikkhu Parikh, used to demolish Jinnah for introducing the idea of self-determination and nationalism into a civilizational state that is India, and having as a result, leading as a result to devastating consequences. In contrast, for Pakistan, partition was the ultimate price for self-determination, for a self-conscious community. But although for both states, partition is a foundational myth, there's one thing on which they both agree, that after 1947, there would be no more partitions, no more secession. It was, in a sense, a view that 1947 marked the end of history, as well as the beginning of modern futures. Interestingly, both countries have the same view of the event, even though, as we know, the experience of Bangladesh challenged the Pakistan perception of no further partitions. I was poignantly reminded of this event when I visited the closing ceremony at the Indo-Pakistan border in Wagah on a trip to Lahore in 2006. Having been there from the Indian side in 1980, I was curious to see how Pakistanis responded to the well-choreographed event or spectacle. It is, if you ever go to the Wagah border, a really moving and enlightening experience. I had been to the border from the Indian side, but it was the first time I was amongst Pakistanis celebrating Pakistan, Pakistani nationalism, and reflecting on the event myself as a Punjabi who had set up a journal on Punjab studies. After the event, I wrote a short article in Seminar, magazine from Delhi, and I likened the event to what Clifford Geertz called the Polynesian cockfight, this Punjabi machismo being practiced at the border, and underlying it a sense of deep difference, as if, if Pakistan had not existed, it would have had to be invented, that we, by virtue of the border, are different and will remain different. Yet we share the same language, we share the same ethnicity, but we are separated by religion. Now, we can go on, I could go on in this vein for most of the talk, and how the ideological operation of partition continues to be a lived experience. But I just want to emphasize two aspects. The first is in terms at the state level, how the experience of 1947 led to the creation of highly centralized states. If one looks at the Constituent Assembly debates in India before 1947, the discussion is very much one of decentralization, or at least efforts to find an accommodation for the Muslim League. But after 1947, things changed, and the whole tenor of the debate of the Constituent Assembly changes, and Congress is able to impose its own vision, its own idea of India going forward. And similarly in Pakistan, the whole discourse before 1947 of the Muslim League is one of decentralization of India as a country of provinces. But post-47, one has a construction of highly centralized state. I suppose what this creates in the long run is a difficult relationship between democracy, religion, and identity. Pre-47, the argument between Congress and Muslim League, or certainly within the Muslim League, is that majoritarianism would not provide the appropriate accommodation or safeguards for minorities, particularly the Muslim minority. Post-47, things changed dramatically, and in a way, majoritarianism, as the experience of India illustrates, was not inevitable. There were checks and balances. But what is a critical question for us today is why it has become so. And I think the issue here is that it's not unrelated to partition. Historians are always reluctant to talk about inevitability. But I think this is an issue that we need to probe on in terms of the South Asian state, the state of South Asian states today is why after decolonization, they are all veering towards one or other form of majoritarian politics that has marginalized the politics of minorities. And this issue was brought home to me very starkly last week when at SOAS we launched the South Asia State of Minorities report. This is a compendium of the state of minorities in every state in South Asia. And in some ways, the debates that took place prior to 1947 have a great deal of resonance today for religious minorities in all the states of South Asia. The second legacy, ideological legacy that I want to speak about is how images of partition or partition events color our understanding of what is called communal violence. Scholars like Paul Brass, Steve Wilkinson, Varshni, and others have spoken about the pathologies of partition violence and how they are reproduced in South Asian states today again and again. The ideological dehumanization of the other, the systematic gender-based violence, and the implicit condoning of such violence by state failure. No state in South Asia is immune from this. It seems to me that this, in some ways, is probably the most tragic ideological legacy and we can speak about this and discuss this at length. But it operates in a quite insidious way at a local level, and no amount of social science theorizing has been able to provide meaningful insights to why we have these events again and again. Okay, just to summarize the ideological legacy, it seems to me that ideology is very diffuse and operates in different levels. It can be at state level, within broadly diffused within society. But for me, I think the critical, and this is something I'm grappling within my work on Indian democracy, much more broadly, is a relationship between democracy, religion, and violence that has continued and has become much more critical today after 70 years after independence, and shows no sign of actually diminishing in the long term. And just to summarize this section, I think if Jinnah, Nehru, and Patel were around today, they would see a remarkable symmetry in the politics of Pakistan and India and their own experience that led to 1947. The second point I want to talk about is about refugees, displacement, resettlement, and ethnic consolidation. Few leaders of the Indian National Congress, or indeed of the Muslim League, expected that what happened would happen, that there would be such mass dislocation and uprooting of communities, and that 15 million would, in the end, would be displaced from their home. The general understanding of historians is that the assumption was, notwithstanding the creation of Pakistan, that there would not be hard borders, that there would be soft borders, and most people would stay where they are. But this assumption was thrown to the winds soon after the Boundary Commission Award. And overall, something like 15 million people moved, nearly 1 million died, and the human cost still remains incalculable. Official narratives after 1947, as Gyan Pandey has pointed out, speak about the appropriation of refugees' experience for nationalist history, the tale of suffering and hardship, and the blame displacement on other communities. My family has its own version of this. My mother's uncle, M.S. Randhawa, who's settlement commissioner for partition, for Punjab after partition, wrote a famous book, Out of the Ashes, which is still used as a standard work, describing the migration from West Punjab. And the government of India also produced its own volume, Millions on the Move. Yet the human cost of experience of refugees was so varied by class, by religion, by caste, community, gender, that these overall narratives do not accommodate such diversity. I don't need to mention the work of Urvashi Bhutalia and the importance of that in centering the experience of women and how women became the targets of otherization of the community. I was surprised to learn in preparing for this talk, that there were still people in camps in Calcutta right up until the last decade. In Cooper's camp in Bengal, set up as a refugee camp, still continues to exist. And likewise of displaced people in Bengal and Pakistan. I think these states of South Asia have learnt very little, probably, from the experience of refugees, of partition refugees. And this is, it seems more evident in terms of the events that are happening in South Asia related to ethnic and sectarian conflicts, of how to manage consequences of internally displaced peoples. But two other important points I want to mention is how the movement of refugees changed the demography of cities like Karachi, Delhi, Calcutta, Dhaka, and indeed the province of West Punjab, where there was a significant change in transformation of the local population. And how internally within states of Pakistan, Bangladesh, and India, this change also created enduring ethnic conflicts. I'm thinking here of Sindh, to some extent East Punjab, the movement for linguistic reorganization, and between refugees and locals in many cities up and down the Indian subcontinent. Clearly, I don't have the time to go into much more detail about the human experience, but it's interesting that 70 years after partition, there is still no memorial to the dead. There is still no commemoration of the event in terms that will provide some degree of closure to what happened. And the grieving continues. I understand a museum is being constructed or proposed in Amritsar on partition and partition experiences. But the two principal states, or three principal states, Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan, are still yet to come to terms with the event at the human level. Quickly moving on, sorry, I'll come back to these issues later. The third key point that I wanted to highlight as a legacy of partition is the Indo-Pakistan rivalry. Sumit is here in the seminar, so I've been ambushed and I must be very careful about what I say. So this rivalry is referred to in many ways in terms of bitter, enduring, and unflinching, and we use the adjective unremitting. In some ways, as I said, it's a rivalry between Congress and Muslim League that before partition was intrastate, has now become interstate with nuclear weapons. And I just want to give my take on this rivalry. Political scientist, a specialist on IR, nuclear weapons are written on this. But I think there are some points which are worth remembering. In one sense, the rivalry has its roots in the messy experience of partition, the bitterness, the rancor, and the violence. For example, the division of assets, financial and real, the territorial anxiety which emerged as a result of the new borders, and Pakistan's enduring fear that it would, in Ayub Khan's words, be gobbled up by India. and its emergence as an insecure or insecurity state. In another sense, the partition discourse is linked to Kashmir. It's often referred to as the unfinished business. My view on this is, I think, even if there is significant peace building over Kashmir, the rivalry will not abate, let alone disappear. Why? And I give a number of reasons for this. The first is that Pakistan's sense of security post-47 has been transformed into a geopolitical rivalry. And this was highlighted by Narendra Sarla in his book, The Shadow of the Great Game, turned into a film recently, Viceroy's House, where he argues that the partition was a strategy of the British Empire in order to maintain a foothold in the Middle East. One could argue that this rivalry has now become part of a broader geopolitical rivalry involving China and other powers. The second reason is, as I highlighted in my own work with Brendan O'Leary and Ian Lustig, is how Pakistan and also to some extent India were both wrong-sized. That is, creating a stable relationship between nation and state. Both nations began life as nation-building failures. So the idea of nation has given hold to notions of state and nation building, which compels these states to cross borders and to cross or contest territories. I don't have the time to go into this argument, which I build in my other work, drawing on the work of Ian Lustig around state expansion and state contraction. Suffice to say that Pakistan's insecurity state dimension leads it to expansionism and adventurism, and India's inability to secure its borders at times also creates territorial anxieties and creates a tension between expansionism and consolidation in the ethnic core. And the third, in many ways, the third point I wanted to make, in many ways related to this, is the understanding of partition itself. A lot of the work on partition is being done primarily, in terms of, as I said, in terms of the causes. Very little work has been done on comparative understanding of partition. India's partition is the pure type of a partition, or what Brendan O'Leary calls a fresh border cut across the national homeland. And this fresh border cut was made by an imperial power in collaboration with insiders. And such a partition is very difficult to reverse. Indeed, it creates a very high threshold for reversibility because it's created along fundamental lines of hatred among proto-nationalist groups, which provides virtually impossible conditions for turning it around, though there are reasons and possibilities that I will highlight when that can be done. Okay, just to summarize, so the key legacy, I suppose, is the Indo-Pakistan rivalry. It's a rivalry which has been transformed. It's not only about Jammu and Kashmir. A lot of the discourse, popular discourse, is somehow, if the Kashmir problem is solved, then everything is stable and peaceful. It's an enduring rivalry based on competing ideas of nationhood, which are difficult to accommodate. At this stage, anyone talking about partition then is necessarily required to talk about conditions for transformation and peace. I will just take Subrata a few minutes to go through these and then summarize, okay? So the common argument here, and we repeat it in the book, is that, as in the European Union, that peace will break out if there's more trade and cross-border interaction between India and Pakistan. There have been periods of peace and there have been periods of conflict. Trade has flown and trade has ceased. And you know, in the early 2000s, there was composite dialogue and some revivalism in the trade between India and Pakistan, and we saw the city of Amritsar coming up again. But I think there are many issues with this approach, not least some analysts argued that you need a political settlement before trade, and not the other way around. And I say this as someone who's in the middle of trying to understand the Brexit negotiations in England, where the European Union is insisting that there is a political settlement before a deal is made on trade. And likewise, the Pakistani establishment very much is keen on having a political settlement before a trade agreement. Secondly, all states in South Asia face common environmental challenges on which they have to cooperate. They have cooperated in a limited way in things like Indus Water Treaty and natural disasters. But again, this level of collaboration occurs, but then is regularly disarticulated. Thirdly, we have much hope often put into people-to-people events, which provide a form of contact, cultural exchanges, bohemie, and recognition. There's a great love for people-to-people contact in all countries of South Asia, not least across the border in the province of Punjab. But at the same time, I have been witness to and experienced how this mood and bohemie can change overnight in the event of an attack or an outrage. I just want also to use the occasion here to highlight the work of my friend here, Amardeep, who's done original research in Pakistan, and how there's a great deal of cultural history and heritage of all communities across borders in South Asia, which is really, is disappearing fast and needs to be preserved and needs to be recognized and used preserved for future generations. At least if the events of 1947 are to be not to be seen as a critical turning point in the history of South Asia. Okay, when I read Amardeep's work, I was reminded of my colleague in Birmingham, who, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, wrote a wonderful work on the Jews in Poland, traces of memory in Eastern Europe, recollecting the rich history of a community which was wiped out during Nazi period. Okay, I've covered a very broad ground, but I just want to now to summarize, if you, Subrata, let me.
Okay.
I think there is a need to connect both the the state level work, which is done by political historians like myself, with the more human-based research, which has become part of the human experience work done by those who want to understand everyday lives. And in my own understanding of partition, I'm moving away from it as an event that happened in 1947 or occurred as a result of the Second World War, to look at long-term implications, not in the way, in a broad sense that one could argue everything is determined by partition today, but how, for example, the history and the politics come together in some institutional processes. For example, why certain decisions were taken by Indian constitution makers about religious minorities, and how they have unfolded over the decades in terms of creating institutions and structures and path dependence around those issues. And here I think, drawing on historical sociology and historical institutionalism, one can bridge the gap between the politics and the history to provide a more nuanced view of the long-term implications, rather than just seeing it as an event which is a source of all tragedy. Secondly, as I've said, we need a richer version of the human experience. It has been expanded in terms of social categories, but it needs to be made much more political, I think, and it's difficult, but it needs to be brought up to be part of a broader narrative of partition. And finally, my own plea, and this is something I've tried to do, is to try to put partition in a comparative understanding. Right until 1989, Bangladesh was one of the few examples of state secession. But since the fall of the Berlin Wall, borders and states have changed. There have been secessions, few partitions, and partition reversals as well. And I highlight the case of Germany, and maybe a soft reversal post Good Friday Agreement in Ireland. And I think the Indian experience does need to be put in that perspective. And finally, whimsically, I've just added that partition experience has a lot to offer the British. We are going through an institutional process of decoupling from the European Union after nearly 40 years or so, and pensions, assets, institutions, everything is being rewritten. And the New York Times had a spoof on this, is that anonymous Indian has been sent to Britain to draw the boundaries of post-Brexit Britain. A take on Radcliffe Maud, and I'll end on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, the Institute of South Asian Studies has a mandate to work on contemporary South Asia. So as director, I had to seek clearance for this particular talk. I mean, what is contemporary about something that happened 70 years ago? At that point, my argument was, we don't know what contemporary means in South Asia. Is the past behind us, with us, or ahead of us? If not, why do we get so worked up about the Babri Mosque? And today, having heard you, Harpal, I feel justified that I stood my ground and we had you here because you have offered 3 areas where we really ought to take this very cerebral lecture further. He's talking about new theory. So what is the South Asian state about? Is it about ethnic states, nation states, state nations, or a very fudgy construction, Indians are fond of it, called the civilizational state? Until we know what kind of state structure we are talking about, we can't really build policies. And policies is the second contribution he's making. He's asking basically, those are the last slides. What can be done for positive changes in the functioning of the South Asian state system to promote peace and economic development? And the third offering that Professor Gurharpal Singh had made was some novelty in an area which is dominated by historians and the nostalgics of partition. He's arguing that one has to rethink the conventional narrative and bring something new and fresh. I think that is the value-added character of a political scientist working on a field which is basically a field for historians. I thought it would be appropriate not just to talk about this partition, but partition theoretically and comparatively. Of course, one doesn't think of it that way. Singapore itself came out of a partition, and the country you now come from is also emerging from a partition. The one thing that you have not talked about is who is to take the blame for this 1 million dead. You have let the Brit scot-free, but that will be an issue to take up further. We have taken a little longer for this conversation, but that still gives a good half hour for a conversation. I would take 3 questions, and there will be 2 rounds. I see Professor Sumit Ganguly. I'll recognize him first, and Dr. Ranojoy Sen. So those are the 2. All right, I'll write my name. I'll be the 3rd one. Professor Ganguly, you're on.
Thanks, Subrata. Gurharpal, that was an absolutely superb distillation of, several bodies of literature with remarkable clarity. I just have one question, which has long vexed me, and that is, what explains the extraordinary violence of partition? After all, these communities may not have sort of intermarried or interdined a great deal. I mean, there's a certain amount of nostalgia about it, but let's be honest, these communities, for the most part, lived separate lives. We have a tendency to have a kind of a roseate view of the past. But on the other hand, apart from occasional outbursts of violence, there was no sort of sustained mass carnage, say even in the 19th century, or for significant parts of the 20th century. And virtually overnight, ordinary men and women become cold-blooded killers.
Yeah, good. Ranojoy?
Thank you, Professor Mitra. I had a question regarding, your treatment of 1947 as a critical juncture with regard to constitutional arrangements. So you, for instance, mentioned the centralized structure of both India and to some extent Pakistan, or that was an outcome of partition. Could you share a little bit more light on the impact that partition had on the constitutional arrangements for minorities? For instance, one of the things that was fairly vigorously debated in the Constituent Assembly was the idea of separate electorates for Muslims. And we know that people like Patel were strongly against that idea. And again, something that has some contemporary relevance is the idea of personal laws. Sure. With this triple talaq thing before the High Court. So could you just shed a little bit more light on 47 as part dependence for the Constitution?
Thank you. Dr. Itika Chaudhary?
Thank you, Professor. Excellent. excellent expose on these issues on hand. You spoke of mainly the partition of Punjab or partition between India and Pakistan, 1947. And yet we know that India has experienced over the last century and a half 3 partitions really. It all began with the partition of Bengal in 1905. Now, well might you say that partition of Bengal did not result in the creation of sovereign states, but the concept of sovereignty was very different then. In any case, the partition of Bengal in 1905 sowed the seeds of East Bengali nationalism as another independent sovereign entity. And then Bengal had 3 partitions really, the partition of 1905, which was rescinded in 1911, 1947, partition of Bengal, and then yet again another partition in 1971. 2 of the partitions led to sovereign sovereign states, sovereign nation states, as a matter of fact. So the idea that at any one of these partitions, history had ended. History did not end with 1905. History did not end with 1947. Has history ended with 1971 in the Indian subcontinent? What we are heading to, or what we headed to after 71 is rather a fruition of the Cripps Mission Plan. Now, the Cripps Mission Plan had other components which might yet see a further well, I hesitate to use the word partition, but Balkanization in the sense that Yugoslavia has undergone of India. Do you foresee this, or do you see the history having ended in 1971? Thank you.
Okay, take these 3 questions.
Thank you. I want to thank 3 colleagues who asked these questions. These are all excellent questions. Shumit, your question could take me a few months to answer. But I will try in a few minutes. This is something I've worked on for nearly 20 years, and it's very deep to me personally. We cover it extensively in the book, and as you are fully aware, Steve Wilkinson has recently done extensive research on this. And for him, the core thesis of his argument is that violence was related to the proportion of demobilized ex-combatants. So his is a grand historical sociology work linking together other case studies from the French Revolution, the Great Reform Act, India's partition, to identifying the particular causes of why the violence was so intense. So these the violence was intense because there were militarized personnel who had seen wartime experience, and they were therefore able to operationalize their skills as trained killers and become part of ethnic cleansing. Now that research is quantitative. It has significant limitations, and it raises questions in itself, which I've done in a paper for a volume produced by Ian Talbot on India and Pakistan's independence. So in that paper, I focus particularly on Sikhs and violence. I think one of the things that differentiates West Bengal from Punjab is that you have a third community. And the existence, partition is an existential threat to that third community, which itself is quite highly militarized. And I'm currently, writing a book on this subject, and I found that, and I didn't mention it in the talk, but the only community that was talking in serious terms about forcibly moving refugees were the Sikhs, forcibly expelling Muslims in East Punjab in order to accommodate Sikhs in West Punjab if Pakistan were created. The Sikh leader Gyani Kardar Singh was more or less saying this in 1947 in March, and he was saying, if this boundary commission goes ahead, or the notional boundary goes ahead, there will be violence. And it's the, Sir Evan Jenkins, the governor, in one of his reports says this is the nearest thing the Sikhs have issued as a threat. That if we don't get what we, consolidation of the community, then there will be ethnic cleansing. So I think the existence of the third community made the exchange of, partition violence in Bengal was not at the same level. But then you see in West Punjab, East Punjab, in Punjab, a high crescendo of violence, and then it dissipates very quickly. And that's related to more or less the complete wiping out of the population. So it's a question which is quite controversial. And one historian has talked in in almost primordialist terms, and to saying that Sikhs were natural-born killers. To which I naturally took great exception. But and his argument is that to kill someone is not easy. You've got to be trained, you've got to be armed, you've got to be sophisticated. But the other side of the argument is that, and this one is not resonated or argued or understood, is that the incipient states of Pakistan and India were both complicit in the cleansing. They offshored it to this. In India's case, they offshored it to the Sikhs. And that is much more insidious. And if one probes into that, there is real concern. So that, we could go on, and I beg you for closure, because the second question, very important. Again, I'm not an expert on the constitutional debates, but those who are, my colleague Rochana Bajpai at SOAS, my student Hiwan Kim, who's just done her PhD, they see a dramatic transformation in the discourse on minorities, that minorities are to have, before June the 3rd plan, there are affirmative action provisions, there are religious-based reservation. But as soon as partition is announced, the minority section of the Constitutional Assembly then changes mode, and it's about, the comments of Nehru and Patel are quite prolific. The rules of the game have changed. Now you have to show your nationalist credentials, and literally you have to be part of a new dispensation. That the consequences of partition are so horrendous, we cannot allow the perpetuation of religious-based reservation. And this argument has been restated by Shashi Tharoor in his recent book about minorities and the British and British culpability in partition. And the third question, very interesting, and in a sense, if I had time to talk about my broader work around right-sizing the state, internal border change is not unrelated to external border changes. So Ian and I have often been criticized by our Bengali colleagues for being too Punjab-centric. We went, in this book, we made a special effort to accommodate events in Bengal. But I think you are absolutely right. The experience of Bengal adds much more to the theory of partition, both in South Asia and much more broadly. And it's something that we haven't reflected on. But 2 points you made about the ideology of partition, and what I was trying to differentiate between the practices of how things are on the ground and how nation states try to impose a particular notion of the event as an end of history. Of course, it's not the end of history. History continues even after Fukuyama. Yeah, you know, it continues. So, but it's how do you construct history? You know, that event is a bad event. It should not be allowed. In as much as the Pakistan establishment did not want, you know, for them, the separation of Bangladesh was a threat to the two-nation idea. And as for the Cripps mission, many people have argued, you know, that the cabinet, not necessarily the Cripps mission, but the cabinet mission plan was the nearest thing to a consociational power sharing India that could have emerged, and Congress' decision to veto that was in line with the Congress decision to, you know, to right-size India to what was governable. And Joya Chatterjee's work on Bengal, you know, very much proves that the Congress party in Bengal wanted that division of Bengal.
Okay, we will start the second round now. I've got a question, you got one, and Dr. Roy, third one. Harpal, there are several things that one can take away from this talk. The last thing that came to my attention was your allegation that Sikhs are not natural born killers. I mean, Urvashi Bhutalia talks about it. There is this incident where a village of Sikhs is facing imminent death or worse, and the father, in this case, has the responsibility of killing the daughter. So he raises his sword and strikes, but the daughter has thick sort of hair, and it falls on the traces. So the throat is not cut. I mean, then the girl takes it aside, says, "Papa, strike again." I mean, we have these incidents. So one has to ask, why was violence in Punjab so much more intense, and why was ethnic cleansing so clean than on the East Bengal side? But that was a comment. My question is about the assertion you made that if Pakistan had not existed, it would have had to be invented. But that's a very serious statement, because one tends to think lightly of Kashmir as the cause of India-Pakistan rivalry conflict. And I have always argued, not knowing exactly why I was making that argument, if the earth opened up and Kashmir dropped through, India and Pakistan would still have those cockfights that you talk about. So why we have to ask, theoretically, I would like to try out on you a very quick hypothesis, is because of the fuzziness of the Indian assertion about the civilizational state. It's such a fuzzy concept that anyone who disagrees with it can be accused of false consciousness, that you are our brothers, you have to be with us, whether you want it or not. As long as one side keeps believing that way, the other side, which wants not to be a part of the civilizational state, will feel aggrieved. And that is where Khalistan comes in, that's where Kashmir comes in, that's where partition comes in. Anyway, I'll let you react to that. Sir, now I'll turn to you if you want to introduce yourself and ask your question, and then we'll turn to Shubhashish.
My name is Manish Maheshwari. I'm not an academic by any shot. Just have a very passionate amateur's interest in history. And my question follows on from Professor Ganguly's question about the role of violence in partition. My question to Professor Harpal is, what role do you think did the first major, as you mentioned, a threat from a Sikh leader before the boundaries were being drawn, what is the role of the Direct Action Day and Jinnah's threat to take it by force? We'll take it by force if you don't give it to us willingly. I mean, the whole discourse on partition violence, I find it remarkable that it doesn't start at 1946. Somehow it gets pushed to 1947.
Subhashish? Okay, would you give him a microphone, please?
Just wanted to have your thoughts about, you brought up this issue of critical conjunctures. And those sorts of arguments, mechanisms are very important, like the mechanisms through which events are sort of transmitted over time. Now here there is a certain, I just want to draw your attention to work that has been done by Ashish Nandi, who interviewed sort of families who have sort of experienced partition. And so you would imagine, for example, memory would be one way, one mechanism through which this sort of transmission happens over time. But here, he found something very interesting, that the people who actually experience the partition violence itself, over time, they tend to be much more sort of forgiving, and they tend to want to have, India and Pakistan to have very warm relations and so on. But it's really the younger generation, younger generation which tends to be extremely aggressive and extremely communal. So that kind of sort of challenges this memory kind of mechanism. So I would have just wanted to know your thoughts on that.
Dr. Amit Ranjan has just sent a book to Oxford on partition, so you have the next.
Thank you, sir. What is the role of constructed differences between Hindus and Muslims? This was started by revivalist movement, and especially in 1940s were commonly exploited by Muslim League.
Okay.
Are there any other questions at this moment? Okay, I'll take that question on because I don't think we'll have a third round. So do you want to give the microphone to Professor Barik from India, Ravenshaw University?
The nationalist historiography from Indian side would make Jinnah a villain in spite of that thing, the direct action theory. But a book by Jashwant Singh, the foreign minister, rather bells him out and gives a different narrative, saying that how Indian other nationalist leaders were eager to be in power and made compromises. And I must appreciate His Highlands Chaudhary saying about Cripps mission. We know that there was a letter on cabinet mission, but I'm taking also Cripps 42. There, you know that Sri Aurobindo, who was a great nationalist, and though he had been tortured by British and haunted by him, but he was the first person to send emissaries to our nationalist leaders then to accept the Cripps mission. He saw that if it is not accepted by Indian leaders, it will lead to vivisection. This is a point. And cabinet mission, of course, would have saved the situation. We would not have gone through this horror and torments and terror. And two more points I would say, that you have said about the majoritarian nationalism taking root everywhere in India and Pakistan mainly. But though there is that type of movement here now in India too, but there are also counter movements against it by the civil society and the judiciary. Bomaike is saying that how the secularism is a fundamental basic structure of the constitution, and political settlement before trade and etc. that brings in the functionalist theorist Mitrani and etc. Not that this is not taking place. Already between India and Pakistan, the trade is there and other exchanges are taking place, and that could rather political settlement Kashmir for 100 years, it will be difficult to settle it. That must be put in the back burner. And I think Professor Ganguly very often has said that once Pakistan becomes a really democratic state, where the military loses its grip over the government, that could bring peace between India and Pakistan. These are my observations.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you to everyone and those questions in particular. Subrata, I very much am in awe of your work on state and stateness, and you know this, that I recognized it in my writing when you were in Hull, and I will go and revisit that work. It's very rich and has a lot to offer for stateness in South Asia, not a very well understood term or even operationalized term. Regarding my question or assertion that if Pakistan had not existed, it would have had to be invented. That's a failing of being part of the LSE School of Nationalism. So it comes from working with colleagues like O'Leary and drawing on the work of Smith and Gellner, is that there was always an exit option. An exit option can be exercised where there is potential for that exit option to be realized. And in a sense, partition is an exit option. And this is linked to that question was raised here on violence, is that, you know, we cover the violence in the book from 1946 onwards, you know, from the Calcutta mass killings right to 47. And the cycle of violence and the slogan is "Leke rahenge Pakistan." You know, that in a sense that if you don't negotiate, we'll take it by force. And that links into the point you made, is that we are not going to be let alone. The violence is not a midsummer madness. It's not something that happens spontaneously. It's well organized, it's well tooled, well resourced, and well planned. And it happens over a time. So it's central to the making of Partition. And in a paper I've written for a collection, I argue that violence is central to state formation experience in South Asia. And this is something where we need to rethink the nature of the violence, drawing on Hannah Arendt's work and the work around cultural assumptions of certain communities and their proclivity to violence. Okay. On the question of memory, critical juncture, Ashish Nandi, excellent point. You know, that even when Gyan Pandey's book on partition, you know, he talks about how the subject is nationalized, but their recollections of their memories is so different. And I would say, you know, to a number of points on this. I think for the older generation, there is still, despite what they experienced, despite what they encountered, there is still a connection with that old traditional society that existed, you know, from which they came, uprooted, and a romantic attachment to that. Whereas for the younger generation, they have been schooled and studiedly nationalized in the politics of post-47. I say this as somebody who used to, in his freelancing times, used to examine scripts for Pakistan studies. You know, these were like, it was an ideological course imposed by General Zia to make Pakistani students Pakistani. And they were so full of ideological biases that they, you know, it was almost like Hindus and Sikhs were off this wall. You know, they were genocidal killers, and this is what happened. The other side of the story is not told. And vice versa, you know, in textbooks in India too. So I think that's a discrepancy, you know, that how society has changed and how nationalism is operated. Post-47, nationalism is operated as an ideological tool. Yeah. Then the final point, yes, I think, you know, ideology, you know, Jinnah's project was very modern, as was Nehru's. They constructed something very futuristic. It ruptured existing social formation. And you're right, you know, Jinnah has been made a scapegoat. I was in Delhi when Jaswant Singh got the sack from the BJP. You know, I was actually outside the BJP headquarters. It's interesting to see a BJP stalwart, you know, defending Jinnah, and then the ideological operation of that process on the party. You know, you can't say this. It is a no-no. It's like, you know, it's like the Queen apologizing for the Amritsar massacre, that she won't do it. And your final points, they're really well taken. I think, you know, you have said things that I don't need to say again. Yeah, I think a lot is happening, and I agree with you. You know, I gave a talk at Heidelberg on the balance between majoritarianism in current day India and opposition to it. What I was trying to argue was much more is why has democracy in South Asia taken this route? You know, why have the checks and balances for minorities not worked? And in that sense, if those checks and balances had worked, perhaps we would not have even had the partition. You know, that goes back to the original question. So, okay.
Okay. I'm now going to say a few words to thank our speaker properly. My takeaway from the conversation we have had today for a think tank is to take South Asia seriously enough to understand the differences of South Asian politics from what is normally associated with the politics of liberal democracies. The concept of time, the nature of violence, or, for that matter, the depth of memory. In this time and day when area studies are under attack everywhere, one has to first understand the specificity of an area and the depth of its history, which is how a think tank entirely committed to policy analysis of contemporary South Asia can bring some depth to its own work and establish its singularity. Having done that, we have to go to the next step and ask ourselves, how can we enrich the larger disciplines of history or political science or neo-institutionalism in terms of the takeaway from area studies? The third point I got out of this conversation was the nature of violence, that violence can't be simply declared as taboo and thrown out of politics. It is very, very important to remember this, not just in Singapore, but everywhere where there is a threat of terrorism and suicide terrorism. Ladies and gentlemen, the whole science of politics, which starts with Hobbes, starts with the promise that if only you'll give up your right to self-driven decisions or self-help, if only you will give up a little bit of your sovereignty over yourself and give it to me, and I'm the state, I'm the Leviathan, I'll protect you from violent, shameful death. And you can then have a life of civilization, peace, industry, and I go on from that to argue, you can actually die in your own bed, surrounded by your loved ones, and maybe with the help of a doctor and the presence of a priest. All these things would happen if you give up self-help. Now, what if someone says, what I want to do is so important to me because I have been violated in an area which I consider sacred, that I want to kill, I want to die as a part of my argument. When that argument is made, several people die. The state, the modern state, political science, and whole institutional analysis based on this political science, because I've always said that no state can have as many policemen as men, and if it did, who will police the police? So we are back to the depth of violence. And there is excellent literature on this, particularly for my young colleagues who are going to do their PhDs. On partition violence, there's a very nice book called The Colors of Violence by Sudhir Kakar, where he has documented memories of partition victims and partition killers. And there he is talking about a variable called chosen trauma, which he takes off, the psychoanalyst Erik Erikson. This is how it happens. Gang rape of a loved one is one of the most violent things one can witness. And he's talking about people who have witnessed such things. And normal impulse would be, if someone does that to your loved one, you must kill or die. But most people don't. Most people run, and they keep running as far as they can, as long as they can, until they feel safe. Behind closed doors, they tell the story of what happened. In order for them to transcend that traumatic experience. So, they occasionally make up facts. And this chosen trauma and making up facts to tell the story to the next generation saying never ever forget and take revenge. That's one answer to Professor Ganguly's question. That's where the dark creatures emerge from underground cellars. And telling the story is one way of transcending your own chosen trauma and move over from being victims to actors. Now the next question is it necessary to go through that ritual of chosen trauma, enhanced violence, not just Hindu-Muslim, go to Serbo-Croatia, you'll have the same thing. Neighbors who have been doing business with one another have intermarried, suddenly remember that your grandfather had raped my grandmother, so I must cut your throat or my wrist. Is it really necessary, or is it possible to do it like South Africans, have a truth commission, and something like a memorial museum in Amritsar of all places, if not, why not in Kolkata, and to say that the million people who died were actually actors too, and we owe them something. We make human beings out of these ghosts. I mean, that I think is one of the very constructive ideas to emerge from this conversation. Just to remind you, Harpal, that even though we work on contemporary South Asia, some of us take the very deep past seriously. So I'm going to give you as a going away gift my book on Kautilya. The subtitle is, what is the subtitle? The Classical Roots of Modern Politics in India. Kautilya's Arthashastra, an intellectual portrait.
It's a good exchange.